Welcome, everyone. I'm Shaun Lether. I'm the SAI affiliated group leader of Hawaiian Islands, and I'm thrilled to invite you all, or welcome you all, to the Spiritually Transformative Speakers panel, or Experiencers panel. Our first speaker is going to be Sha'alah Ivory. Sha'alah has undergone many unusual spiritual experiences beginning from a very early age. She studied various traditions of dance and visual art, comparative myth and religion. Sha'alah is a student of science, religion, perceptual neuropsychology, and Vedanta. She has practiced professional midwifery, lectured in Egypt and Nepal as a keynote speaker in the 2004 Polish National Obstetricians Conference, and lead consultant for Warsaw First Birth Center. Discovering her psychic abilities under Suzanne Giesmann's tutelage, she currently offers readings to interested parties. Welcome, Sha'alah.
Thank you so much for inviting me here, and congratulations for sticking it out to almost to the end of the conference, everybody. Now, even though, as you have heard, I was trained primarily as a healthcare professional, and I received a doctorate in business and law looking at pharmaceutical malfeasance, because I've had so many STEs all my life, I've had to enlarge my view far beyond a strictly materialist approach. And now, as was said, among other things, I'm an artist and a practicing medium. And I'm sure many of you have set out on a similar journey, despite yourself. Now, for 4 decades, I've been watching as more and more people find themselves on this path, and they do it in all different kinds of ways. But I'm becoming concerned at what I see as an overemphasis on what's popularly known as the right brain. I'm hearing over and over again that we should move from the head to the heart, not rely on or trust our thinking, but just our feeling and intuition. And I'd like to suggest that, just a second, here we go, that this current trend on not thinking, on working only with energy from the heart, is as wrong-headed and as misleading as depending too much on analytic thought and so-called left brain activity. If you move too far in either direction, you're just kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I was taught that the Buddha offered 64,000 different practices because there's so many different kinds of people, and what works for one may not work for another. Now, thinking or left brain type analysis is just a tool, and all tools can be used in all kinds of purposes. But for those of us whose strengths lie in thinking, who are actually adepts at this kind of activity, and for many of us in the West, it's because of how we've been taught to think. It may not be optimal for us to drop thinking in favor of something much less natural to the way our minds have been trained. So to illustrate, I'm going to discuss a little bit of current brain science that looks at left and right brain perspectives, and then I'll recount a couple of my own experiences that arose directly from thinking practice. Now, of course, we all know there's been much reliance, even more so every year, on so-called left brain approaches, and these are analytic. They're based on scientific method, which insists that all phenomena that we deal with, they have to be observable, repeatable, measurable, and intersubjectively verifiable. But cutting-edge brain science is putting forward the possibility of a much more balanced approach to understanding how we construct reality, and a balance that includes left and right brain perceptions. So in the diagram, it's the little bit in the middle, which is actually growing. That's what the arrows indicate. Now, Ian McGilchrist, he's a neuroscientist, a psychiatrist, and a philosopher. He says he doesn't like to talk about left and right brain tasks per se. Instead, he suggests we should think about different kinds of attention, as it's our attention that determines, quote, how our world comes into being, how we experience the world. We can only know the world that we experience. And this is absolutely in line with many spiritual teachers who go on about attention and intention being the basic building blocks of a spiritual path. Just think of how differently people hear the same piece of music. A professional musician hears something quite different from an acoustic engineer, and they both hear something quite different from just a run-of-the-mill music fan. So the phenomena are exactly the same, but the experiences are not. And McGilchrist claims that there are 2 kinds of attention. One kind is directed mostly to finding or catching our food or our prey, sort of over evolution. So it's very tunnel vision. It's very precise and clear in its detail. And primarily in human beings, it's in the left hemisphere, and it comprises about 30 degrees of the field of vision. The other kind of attention, it ranges over 180 degrees, and it includes the periphery. So that way we can sense whether something dangerous is there, something good. Is it a predator coming? Where are our children in the field? So left hemisphere attention perceives all things as reducible to parts. It sees decontextualized categories and abstractions so that it knows what it is looking at by centering on little fixed details in the field. Whereas right brain attention isn't static, but is flowing. Everything is what it is because of the context in which it finds itself, and it sees unique details within a great big field. It's much closer to how we actually experience our lives. So the left brain would see a person, and the right brain might see this person. Now you may be asking, what has this got to do with spiritual paths? In classical Buddhism and Hinduism, as in many other spiritual traditions, practice is divided into different streams. And classically, it has been divided into the 3 streams on the screen there. So bhakti, which is the yoga of devotion to a deity or to a guru or teacher. Karma yoga, which is compassionate action in the world, the path of service. And jnana yoga, the path of wisdom and knowledge or application of the intellect. Now, I've always been drawn to jnana practice. When I was young, it was Zen philosophy I was interested in. Then more recently, Tibetan Buddhism in the Kagyu tradition, which stresses the sharpening of the mind. And most recently to the faith of my birth, which is Judaism, which had until very recently remained more or less a closed book to me. Now, during both Buddhist and Jewish meditational practice, I had STEs that demonstrate very clearly just how powerful intellection may be as a spiritual tool. Although I had all sorts of other meditational arisings under the guidance of my Lama, Namgyal Rinpoche, I once underwent a whole series of STEs directly out of left brain practice in a seminar concerning shunyata, or emptiness. We were following along as the teacher examined the concepts of self, emptiness in astronomy and subatomic theory, of infinity and interdimensionality in physics. The first direct realization that arose was I suddenly found myself in 2 worlds. This one with a normal world, normal perception, and another one that was this misty but very detailed overlay, apparently in a 2D world. And what I thought while I was in this place, that was that from any higher dimension, all phenomena in a lower dimension appear as illusory. And from a lower dimension, all phenomena in a higher dimension are just unimaginable. Now, let me elaborate a little bit. We can imagine dimensions along axes. So you've got width along the x-axis, and you've got height along the y-axis, and depth along the z-axis. But from the 3rd dimension, when we look at a 2D world, nothing has any depth. The z-axis is always 0. So this means that the other 2 axes are infinitely thin, right? They've got no depth. So all 3 dimensions in this 2D world are conceivable, but not perceivable from the 3D world. In other words, they're illusory. So we can conceive of things in the 2D world, but we can't actually perceive them other than as sort of schemas, mental patterns, like the drawing of the plane of perception in the middle of the diagram. Because of this arising, though, I was both perceiving and conceiving it, because I was actually in the experience and surrounded by phantasms of polygons in this really weird 2D world. And for hours, I was jumping in and out like an interdimensional trampoline artist from one dimension to the other, like huge and then flat and huge and flat and real and illusory, kind of at the same time. I could see clearly from this what Buddhist and Hindu philosophers mean when they claim that the everyday world of appearances, or samsara, is illusory, because the great sages are viewing this world from a higher dimension. So the same applies for them. Now, more recently, MacPhail, he's a British psychology professor from London University. He claims, just like physicists studying quantum mechanics claim, that the world is no more than a projected perception. So the polygon in the middle of the picture there, What we normally think of, he says, as the perceived physical world is a form of virtual reality created by the mind-brain world. Very strange. Now, later in the same retreat, I had a major STE during Namgyal's discussion of the divide between the subject and predicate. And in this experience, there weren't two worlds, just one, and not this one. As he talked about the impossibility of delineating between self and not self, I was listening with this total attention, trying to wrap my head around the actual meaning of the words he was using. The concentration was so intense. There was this suspension of disbelief and of belief. There wasn't room for any other assumptions in there. And I was trying to formulate a reference point from which to ask a question. And I started to say, I, and Namgyal said, no. Oh, I just kind of stopped all of a sudden and kind of backed up, regrouped. Okay, we're going to go at it again slightly differently. And this time I said, we, and Namgyal said, no, again. This time, my thinking stopped dead and something else rose up very powerfully. Now, after the fact, I understand that what he did was do a true koan, and he wants to describe koan as end of speech. And it's a central aspect of the jnana part of Zen practice. As koans are designed to manipulate your thinking so that your consciousness suddenly expands. So very skillfully, my teacher had used what he said to kind of catapult me into another state of consciousness altogether. And as my intense thinking was forced to a sudden halt, this tsunami of altered consciousness began to rise up in a wave, and I could see it was going to obliterate everything. And I sort of laughed and said to Namgyal, well, might as well shut up then. This wave of joy, charged consciousness rose up, and it was as irresistible and as powerful as a bolt of lightning in front of 40 students. I looked at my husband and I said, here we go. And then the wave absolutely crested. And I was carried away in a flood of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which I defined for you on the screen there. Unlike earlier in the retreat, this time I became completely unaware of normal surroundings. And I was simply witness to this amazingly beautiful field, moving patterns of lights and colors. And I didn't exist in the field. It was just the field covering the whole field of perception. Everything here felt really, really silly, absurdly funny, hugely funny, like being in the middle of a huge cosmic joke. And apparently I was laughing my head off as I sort of slipped down to the floor of the temple. And Namgyal just said, oh, she'll be fine. And he carried on with his lecture. And I came back to normal consciousness about a half an hour later or so. Now, both these STEs showed that although the fruits of the discipline are like the fruits of any path, this particular path is not one from the heart, nor is it one from a deliberate cessation of thinking. Rather, it seems to be the result of a very tightly focused, utterly concentrated state of mind, led by the left brain into a harmony between left and right brain awareness. Another striking example occurred during my explorations into Jewish practice. As I said, in investigating other traditions, many years I avoided Judaism because what I knew of it didn't seem very effective. You know, lots of liturgy, praising God, and the Bible studies sort of from the psychological viewpoint, and many, many rules of conduct. But about 3 years ago, I decided to look into the more esoteric aspects of it. And I found that the core of Jewish mysticism was very similar to those I'd studied in other traditions. So as a practice, I started to read aloud an English translation of the liturgy on festival nights. And right off the bat, I discovered, surprise, it's filled with references to life after death. No less than 17 times during the first night of Rosh Hashanah, the new year, it's mentioned that God could be trusted because he reanimates the dead. Now, I never knew that. So what else didn't I know? It was one Friday night doing Sabbath that the jnana yoga nature of Jewish practice is made very clear. In a prayer summoning the Malachim, God's messengers or angels, I was concentrating very hard again on the meaning and extent of the words and all the names of God, what it really referred to. So the Most High, the King of Kings, the creator of the universe, God is this, and God is this, and God is this. And suddenly, my understanding of what this higher power was expanded hugely. For years, I'd had a pretty stable conception and experience of what I understood to be God. And now in one instant, boom, it shifted. I was overcome by tears of joy and gratitude and awe at this unexpected glimpse into the exalted realms of what all these names of God actually pointed towards. And every name was floating on an awareness that it was this incredibly loving power that kept it all going. It was quite something. And within this huge panoply of possibilities, it was really not probable that I should even exist, let alone have this view. It was really something. Now, back to the brain. Lisa Miller's MRI research has demonstrated that meditative states associated with high amplitude alpha and theta waves, so the slower than normal, a heart kind of connection. But other research shows something quite different. A head connection during mystical states in longtime meditators and mediums where they have gamma brain waves, so very fast ones at the top, at the other end of the spectrum, and that are normally associated with very intense intellectual work. Now, these waves increase rapidly and they become coherent. That is, they fire in synchronous oscillations across both hemispheres. So both sets of brain waves, the alpha and theta, the heart, and the gamma, the head, are associated with various altered states of consciousness in which people can have mystical visions and contact spirits and see things remotely and psychically and so forth. So in conclusion, it looks as though even brain science gives us evidence of many paths to the top of the mountain, whether diving into the nature of self in the East or God or the world in the West. And from East and West, they're the same jnana technique, an intellectual rigor of complete concentration coupled with an eradication of assumption that just blows the mind wide open. This might be a method that is especially amenable to Western minds trained in the left hemisphere dominated paradigm of rationalism and science. It's just something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Sha'alah, for that very enlightening and enthusiastic talk. So our next our second speaker will be Kristin Lemaster. She's an energy coach and the founder of Soulful Navigation. She is a scientist and engineer who practices more than 30 energy modalities. Kristin strives to help people align their lives with their energy for greater ease and fulfillment. She has learned how to let her spirit lead in all aspects of her life, and her mission is to condense her energy knowledge and experience into a simple and easy to understand format that anyone can implement. Welcome, Kristin.
Great. Thanks, Shaun. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the entire SII board for hosting this impactful and enlightening weekend. It really has been amazing, and I am honored to be here. So thank you again. So as the conference winds down, I wanted to switch gears and talk about a different phase of the awakening process, being that what happens after we're awake. During this weekend, we have heard some incredible data and stories about these spiritually transformative experiences, from Kundalini awakenings to NDEs to spiritual emergencies. But what does come after we are awake? What happens after our spiritual emergence? In my experience as an energy practitioner in studying all of those modalities, in my opinion, this maintenance phase, if you will, of the spiritual awakening process can be one of the most important periods in our life. When we are in this phase after waking up, we have the opportunity to realize the full potential of what it means to be a spiritual being living in a physical form, having a human experience. And that potential is infinite. Okay. The possibilities are endless for what we can bring into this physical world after we wake up. And this part of our life also opens us up to accelerating both our individual spiritual growth as well as the evolution of the collective. So again, I'm very passionate about how we live an awakened life, because Again, in my experience, this is when we can have the greatest positive impact on a global scale. Now, that all sounds wonderful, but living an awakened life is not always easy. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I read an article almost 10 years ago now that was research results summarizing the experiences that people often have after an NDE. And they included things like long-term depression, broken relationships, career disruption, living with this sense of alienation and altered reality. And this article has always stayed with me because, again, in my energy practice, I see a lot of empirical data that supports these experiences. And in particular, a lot of this struggle comes during the transition from the height, the pinnacle of the spiritual awakening, as we transition back into our physical life. So just for some context, I have been studying, I call it energy, for more than 20 years. It started when I was taking a lot of quantum physics classes when I was getting my graduate degree as an engineer. I have studied a lot of different modalities, but over this time, I teach, I coach, I work one-on-one. I also have a podcast where I bring together a lot of practitioners from different backgrounds so that we can talk about stuff like this and share experiences. So again, for context, over the last, let's say 10 to 15 years, after, talking and deeply working with thousands of people, the trend that emerges again is that there is a period of chaos and confusion and often depression that comes after someone has had the experience of the expansion, the bliss, the humor, right? The unconditional love that just changes us after a spiritual awakening. When people go from that experience back into their physical life, that's when some of the struggle comes in. Now, I went through this myself when I became a full-time energy medicine practitioner. For me, I spent all day in the unified field helping people to heal and awaken. And when I transitioned back to my physical life, I used to call it suffering. I couldn't get off the couch. Doing my daily activities, being in my body, felt like walking uphill through mud every day. And I live a very privileged life. I don't have a lot of suffering in my life. And yet I had no motivation to be fully present in the physical reality of my life after experiencing the bliss. You could often hear me say during that period of time in my life that I would be like, sometimes it really stinks to be awake. It was that kind of an experience. Thankfully, this period can be finite. So again, as an engineer and a scientist, part of my mission is to test and try as many spiritual practices as I can so that I can identify the ones that are the most powerful, efficient, repeatable, so that we all can live an awakened life in a practical way. And that's what I'm going to show you over the next 10 minutes. So again, as I'm sharing my screen, I do like to say I'm actually a little bit embarrassed that when I say I've tried more than 30 modalities over the last 20 years. But what I'm going to show you now are kind of my top 3 tips for what I have found to live an awakened life in our current world. We're going to just go ahead and jump right in. Okay. Tip number 1. Use a different kind of effort to get through life. And we are now talking more about getting through life and actually stepping into the continuous flow state of letting your spirit lead you through life. This is where the ease, the synchronicities, the fulfillment, the ability to help others comes from when you are in that flow state. And this tip is the biggest one. It's a paradigm shift, and it is about choosing to walk a new path in your life. Okay. But before we talk about the new path, let's take a look at the old path. Okay. The old way before we are awake is we would have a goal or a challenge in our life. We might start off by sticking our heads in the sand. Again, this is kind of a symbol for that self-distraction and honestly cutting ourselves off from the awareness of the subtle field that is happening all around us. And then we just hit it with a lot of physical, mental, and emotional effort, right? We are muscling our way through life with our mind and our body. Okay. Maybe there's a little spiritual effort in there, right? We're having discrete spiritual experiences, not the continuous flow state. So we're meditating, we're going to yoga, we're praying, we are aware of the field, but we're barely scratching the surface. Okay. So, and I don't know if you want to put in the chat if this sounds familiar to you. But again, when I look at the world now, we see a lot of this muscling our way through life. Okay. So what does this new effort look like? This new way? We have a goal or a challenge, and the first thing we do is put in big spiritual effort. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. After the big spiritual effort, we have a much less need for that physical, emotional, and mental effort. And in fact, that kind of effort, that mind-body effort, can then be funneled into taking advantage of the opportunities that we have created with our spiritual effort. Okay, so what does spiritual effort look like? We're still talking about this new way where we are just going to focus our newfound effort after being awake. Okay, spiritual effort takes advantage of our new awareness. It's our wisdom and information, the access to the wisdom and the information. It's about taking higher vibrations and bringing them into physical form, right? So when I think about spiritual effort, I usually set up this framework called the 4 Ps. And again, I'd love for you all to try this out and get back to me and tell me how it works. So the 4 Ps, it starts with taking a pause and coming into presence. Now, a lot of teachers will tell you you can stop right here. Okay. So many teachers say just being fully present in every moment is being in the continuous flow state. And I think that that's right. We are humans, though. So when you need a little help with that, then you go into your practices. And there are thousands of spiritual practices, right? Can work on a grounding practice. I always say, when in doubt, ground. Okay. Grounding will always help us. I like to use practices where we go into the unified field, we create, we download information, we bring it back down into physical form, right? But it could be a shamanic journey. It could be working with your Kundalini. Whatever practices really help you to, again, tap into that awareness, wisdom, information, and those high vibrations. And finally, the last P is for people, because finding yourself in a community just like this one will help to support your spiritual growth, will help you to develop new spiritual habits so that it becomes automatic to walk through your life using your spiritual effort. And again, using the spiritual effort, I always say it's let the energy do the work, let the spirit show you the way. We do not have to struggle as much as we do when we take that pause, we come into presence and we work on our spiritual effort. So that is tip number 1. Okay. Tip number 2, we've heard a lot about this in the conference so far. This is about taking your higher level of consciousness and bringing it into your physical body and living it, okay? We have a higher level of consciousness, right? I mean, we still have to function in our life, earn a living, take care of our loved ones, right? We're trying to discover and live out our soul purpose. Well, let's do all of that while we are embodying this higher level of consciousness that we were able to open the door to during our spiritual awakening. Now, one trend that I see all the time is that when people are in the midst of a spiritual awakening or have had one, we stay in the unified field, right? We're in touch with source. We're in chakras 7, 8, and 9. We love to live up here. All of our energy is up here. We don't bring it into our body because it can be uncomfortable. But what I am suggesting here is to don't do that. Take your energy and bring it all the way down into your physical body. Bring it into your grounding. And again, in my opinion, we're here to live in a physical form. That is our goal. Our physical body is that perfect union between source energy and earth energy. So taking, we have to come back from vacation at some time, right? Come down from source, come down from the unified field somewhat, and really live that energy in your physical form. Now, this is where the work comes in, okay? There's often a lot of fatigue when we do this, as our body, our cells, our DNA gets upgraded with the new vibration, okay? Big emotions come up. Sometimes our relationships change. Our goals in life may change. You have to get comfortable with this level of uncertainty, right? Because you just don't know what is going to unfold. So again, live the energy in your physical form, but don't be discouraged if it feels like work to you. That's a very common experience. All right, and wrapping up, tip number 3 is, sometimes after our spiritual awakenings, we try to come back and squeeze ourselves back into our old life. And we try to get back into where we were. And my suggestion would be to take a deep breath and let the field bend around you. Let the field bend around your new vibration, okay? When we think about the unified field, we often think about it as a spider web or a grid, right? So, imagine coming back down with your higher self, these higher vibrations, and you're trying to squeeze yourself into this preformed grid. Well, in actuality, you can come back down and let the field bend around your new vibrations. And what that does is it will create ripples in the field that will help with the global awakening, okay? This is the group field effect. We're doing it right now. We have created a group field here with everybody in this conference. And when one person is lifted up, we are all lifted up. So my favorite saying is, a rising tide lifts all boats. And here we are awake. We're letting the field lift up around our new vibrations. And in doing that, we're lifting up the global ascension, Earth's ascension, all of it, right? Just by doing your inner work, you are helping with the global awakening. So I want to say thank you, but, I also want to say that, I personally feel really lucky to be living in this time. We live in this time of both spiritual crisis and spiritual awakenings. And it's things like this that are going to help us tip the scales towards progress, towards spiritual awakenings. So thank you so much for your time. I would love to hear your thoughts. I always love to hear what people think. If you'd like to take a snapshot or a screenshot, my website is there, but also wanted to mention I do have an app if anyone wants to download it. It's on Apple and Google. It's a progressive web app too, so you can look at it on a browser, but there's a lot of free educational content on there and the schedule of our podcast. So thank you again. It was, again, I'm truly humbled to be here. So thank you. Back to you, Shaun.
Thank you so much, Kristin, for that important information. What you're doing is so valuable. I wished I'd known you when I was going through my spiritual emergency. So thank you so much. That was just wonderful. So our next speaker is going to be Althea Watson. Althea started sensing and communicating with the spiritual world before she was 7 years old. She's had 2 NDEs, many other STEs, and her abilities include clairvoyance, clairaudience, mediumship, energy medicine, psychometry, and tracking energy for environmental investigations. Althea is a life coach who works with survivors of trauma, those in personal and spiritual crisis. She has been recognized for her insights into health and personal awareness issues and has conducted energy medicine sessions for crisis, cancer, and AIDS centers. She has been a consultant for businesses, including Fortune 500 members, and a guest speaker for spiritual organizations, theaters, expos, and colleges. Welcome, Althea.
Thank you so much. Just to one thing, because what an introduction you gave me. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. But my name is pronounced Althea.
Althea, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
so, but you were close, and I have to say that's not unusual. So
Actually, I do know your name. We've chatted several times, but I was talking to an Althea earlier today, so I completely apologize.
That's okay. That happens all the time. So no worries here. Yeah, I want to talk about a spiritually transformative experience I had. And I haven't talked about this one, and it's perfect for this environment because it it is reflective of how many people are looking for a spiritual connection. So let me just get started with sometimes what my guides do, and this has started at an early age, is that they will take me places. They'll like tap me on the shoulder, I'll get in the car, and they kind of drive through me. And so I was in the Chicago North Shore area on April 2005, and I was staying north of Chicago, and Spirit taps me on the shoulder. I go to my car. I'm on the Kennedy Expressway going to Chicago. I find the Fullerton exit, and then all of a sudden my guide disengages. I'm at the bottom of an exit ramp of an expressway, and I'm like, what do I do here? Where do I go? No response. So I take a left, I get onto Fullerton Street and pull over and just go, what is this about? Now, what happens sometimes is we are here for spiritual lessons, and we do have discernment, and we do have free will. So there are times where we're in situations where all of a sudden our guidance is quiet because we're the student taking the test. We're given choice. And I didn't realize it in that moment, but I was given choice. I was given choice, actually, I saw it in retrospect, to just go off the freeway and go back north, or to go and visit someone in Chicago, or pull over and take an assessment of the situation, which is what I did. And what I noticed is, my goodness, Fullerton Road, what a busy road usually, but there was not a car, a truck, or a person anywhere. No, the whole time I was there going, okay, what's this about? Let me take this in. There was no interruption. You could hear a pin drop, and I'm right by the Kennedy Expressway. I'm like, okay, this is pretty wild. I noticed there's no parking on each side of Fullerton. There was no garbage in the streets anywhere. Absolutely pure, clean. There was no etheric energy. There was no like lost spirits. I'm like, hey, I'm good to go. I've checked this out. The one thing I got was there was a feeling of anticipation. Something was going to happen. And I feel that I got that from the environment and, of course, from within myself. So I thought, all right, something's going to happen here. We'll just take note of that and go on. 3 days later, I had clients in Chicago I was seeing. So I was on my way back to the north side or north suburbs where I was visiting. And I'm on Fullerton Street. And all of a sudden, I noticed there are people everywhere. I'm just seeing their backs. They're all like walking. It's almost like, you know, when you go to a concert and you fall in line and you're in the flow of the concert. It's like, that's what it was. Everyone fucking west. I'm like, all right, I'm going in the right direction. And then I noticed there's like lines of parked cars on Fullerton, on each side of Fullerton Road. I'm like, wow, what is going on here? I get closer to the exit ramp that I'm going to pass to take the ongoing ramp, and a car pulls out that's parked right there. So I go, whoa, I see a mob of people at the underpass. There are like 100 people there. It's like, what's going on? So I pull into this parking space and I go over to see what's going on. So I go over and I'm saying, there are, you know how the police put up horses for crowd control, keep everyone in like even lines? There are those. There is a Channel 9 bus, and they're filming what's going on. And I go to someone and I say, what is all of this about? And someone says, well, this woman, her last name was Delgato, was driving by and she saw a vision of the Divine Mother in this image that's on the screen. That is a salt drip on the wall of the Fullerton underpass. She told a couple of people, and they told a few people, and all of a sudden we have hundreds of people coming to have an experience with the Divine Mother. And what goes on with this is I start interviewing people because I'm like, wow, what's this about? I interviewed conservative Christians, New Age Christians, Course in Miracle followers, people that are Jewish, people that are Buddhists, a lot of Baha'i, Santeria was there, atheists, agnostics. There was a whole group of satanic people, and I don't know if I've left anyone out, but all I could think of was I don't think I'd ever been in a place where there had been so many varieties of religions in one place, all looking for a spiritual experience. How cool is that? I'm like, oh, we so need this in the world. And someone that I interviewed at the beginning came back to me and he goes, well, I'm not seeing anything. I'm not hearing anything. I don't see the Divine Mother. And I thought, well, how do you approach a sacred space? First of all, you have to recognize that everything is sacred. There is no place that isn't sacred. Because I had someone come over to me and say, well, I don't believe that the Divine Mother would show up at the underpass of an expressway. It's just too dirty. I don't know, talk to Jesus about where he's been. I just go, to me, everything in this world, everything in this universe is sacred. Everything is a sacred space. And when you want a sacred experience, after you look at the sacred space around you, you need to connect with the sacredness and the divinity in you. And I mentioned that to a couple of people, and they were like, what? And I thought, okay, let's just go on with this. But our life force is consciousness. It's the all, it's God, it's whatever you want to call it. It is the supreme energy. It is the creator of everything. And we are aspects of that. And that's what is in us. So when we want to have this spiritual experience, we need to call on this. We need to say, I have desire to have relationship with the divine. And it starts with us, especially because everything outside of us is just a projection of what's inside of us. There's a phrase that someone used to say that is, I'm not an individual, I am a population. And I think that's so true. There's so many aspects of self within ourselves. And looking at all these people looking for a divine experience, I'm like, all aspects of all these people here are looking for coagulation. They're looking for a divine experience and uniting within themselves. And how you do that is saying, I want to have an experience with the Supreme Being, with the divine in me. Then you invoke. Invocation comes from lots of different things. The candles, let's see what we've got here. Let's see if we can get, okay. There were hundreds and hundreds of candles that were out here. You can see that's the wall that you saw in the last picture. This is how wide of flowers and candles, and people were writing notes. You can see this man, he's got his hand where the vision of the Divine Mother came. This is how people get in touch with their supreme being. Through words, people were praying very quietly, through candles, through flowers, through notes, through touch, to make it real, to ground yourself with that experience. The next thing that I realize people should look at is that when we want to have an experience of seeing divinity, spiritual guides, higher self, we work with our chakra system. We see everything in an altered state. So yoga, breathing, prayer, meditation, all helps to get us into a relaxed state. This woman that saw the Divine Mother had been deep in prayer. She also was driving, and driving is another activity that we can do that will put some people in a trance state. It just does. The monotony of driving, there's something that takes over, and all of a sudden they're in a relaxed state and they're starting to see etheric energy, and people have stories of that. That's another way to get into a relaxed state, so you can go, oh my goodness, I'm starting to see etheric energy. How people see the divine is sometimes with STE, it's just like this explosion in us, and we have the appearance of an apparition of the divine, of some aspect of the divine. There are other times where we want to work at relaxing our presence in the world and have a relaxed state so we can start to see the etheric matter. And so that's one thing that I don't think a lot of people realize. Eyesight, the way the eye is constructed, it's so much easier to see spirit peripherally. It's because of the construct of the eye and how the cones are and how we see color. That's not, I'm not going to talk about that now. That's a different lecture, but you know, one way to see spirit peripherally is just that. We're focused here, but we have a sense of what's out here because we're using our senses to see the spirit anyway. So that opens us up to that. And then we talk about what we want. What we want is a relationship with the divine. When we call upon this God in us, it shows up. And everyone was saying all afternoon, I want what she had. I want what her experience was. And all of a sudden, I went back to my car because I was like overwhelmed with talking to all these people for hours. I got in my car and I thought, whoa, it's about every God, every relationship with our God. Each one of us is so personal and individualized that we want to say, I want my own experience. I don't want hers or his or his. I want my own experience backed by my faith and what I believe in. When I said that, and I said it to myself and I said it out loud, and all of a sudden, the size of a marble in my lower abdomen, where my soul is, it's kind of like between my first and second chakra, this warmth just emanated through my body. And I felt this divine love. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I feel when I have the NDE. And then I felt the peace just flow through my heart. And I heard, this is in you. This is you. And you can call upon this state of being at any time. And that's how I had this STE in this remarkable group of people, all searching for their own experience with God. Thank you so much.
That's beautiful, Althea. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I so want to thank SAI and all the people working to put this together. What an amazing 2 days this has been.
It's been wild. So thank you so much. Now we have Jean. Are you here, Jean? Our final speaker will be Dr. Jean MacPhail, who was born in Scotland in 1941 and raised by her grandmother, a deeply spiritual and psychically gifted woman. Jean lost her mother to suicide, and her father struggled with PTSD and alcoholism after World War II. Jean later attended the University of Edinburgh and worked on a PhD in neuropharmacology in the 1960s. Jean later became a formal Vedanic nun and is the author of a book called Spiral Life, which chronicles her first 40 years of inner life and meaning. Welcome, Jean.
I'm going to talk about different cycles in my life. I'm over 80 years old. Each cycle is 20 years. And this is just a characterization. As a childhood, the issues were of physical stability and security. When I was a young adult, the issues were of self-esteem, conviction about my validity, and self-confidence and love. The third cycle, intellectual discernment, the ability to get through to the principles behind the events and outcomes of my ongoing life. And the fourth one, when old age, which I've got past already, intuitive ability to see all of the previous stages as an evolutionary progression, as well as the ability to involve by bringing my more evolved insights to bear on earlier issues. In actual fact, the sequence of events is not all in the same horizontal plane. What is happening is that the progression of cycles is actually moving perception or consciousness vertically towards a different level, as happens in a helix. Each cycle exhibits 4 5-year quarters, which are more or less defined by the sequence of events in the cycle. The first 5 years are marked by building stress from relationship with an adult or superior for reasons I cannot understand. As the tension builds about the 4th year of the cycle, I have a premonitory dream. Oops. I don't know if this is all showing. I have a premonitory dream that served to soothe me and brace for the worst. The dream is about an archetype. Oops, I can't see it because there's so much stuff superimposed on it. It's about an archetype with whom, for the most part, I was not familiar at all. But it gave me tremendous inspiration that served me to prepare for the crisis I knew was coming. In the first cycle, the challenge was my mother's suicide, which I distant viewed from about 3 miles away as it was happening. 18 years later, what I saw was corroborated by the medical examiner's office records. More or less within a year after the first challenge, I meet a spiritual mentor whose personal balance and experience helped me to recover my balance and start to express myself in such creative and scientific activities. The influence of the spiritual mentor leads to rising inspiration in my life. At the same time, external pressures begin to work on me. In the first cycle, as my father's returned from World War II with raging PTSD and alcoholism that naturally upset my emotional balance and led me to become an aggressive and angry little girl, it looked as if I was going to be a problem child of the first order. However, when I was 10, I had the first out-of-the-body experience of my life, one of 4, each of which occurred halfway through the cycle. That is when I was 10, 30, 50, and 70, and served to diffuse my state of crisis. I'm going to describe this as I saw it. I was on vacation in the northeast part of Scotland. It was August, and I was out on a walk with my cousin. My cousin was a jokester and decided to disappear, leaving me standing in a clearing in the woods by myself and without a clue how to find my way out or home. The air was totally still and the sun very bright. Suddenly there was a gust of wind, and the tiny leaves of all of the silver birch trees, similar to aspens in the US, rippled upward in the wind. At that moment, I left my body and entered an empty space, filled with beautiful, calming light, in which all of my distress disappeared completely. I felt totally supported and loved. What was most prominent was the profound sense of meaning that I experienced. I have no idea how long I was in that space, but after a while, I felt myself moving downwards. My sense of identity had returned, and I looked down to see what was happening. I saw my body still standing in the clearing about 400 feet below me, wearing my blue corduroy dress. I realized I was headed back to my body and began to shout, "I do not want to go back to that miserable wee body." But of course, I had to go back into it willy-nilly. I never mentioned this or any other internal experience to anyone, but I did tell my second spiritual teacher about it 20 years later. He remarked, Some people are psychic, but what is important is how did this experience affect your life? I went home and gave it thought. It all came back to me. After that experience, my anger and tendency to violence was gone. I was able to bear my father's outbursts and to distance myself from him. I was in charge of my life now and able to function normally at home, at school, and with my family. This is the point in the cycle. And I was a much happier wee camper than I was before the experience. This was the first example I had of how healing these experiences are. This was a particularly major one because, as I now see as clear as day, a taproot started to go down into my psyche that has helped me to withstand all of the other traumas I've had to go through. There's all kinds of these signs here blocking my view. The following quarter in the cycles, I made a decision about my career that changed what was expected. This was at this point. In the first cycle, I gave up artwork, at which I was very good, and decided to become a medical doctor. After being a doctor and working at Harvard Medical School, I became a Vedantic nun. From there, I went on to become an independent author. And finally, I returned to Scotland to live after 50 years in the United States. All 4 times I did this, I ran into a lot of external opposition and struggle. But the inner meaning that I felt with all that I did kept me afloat and got me to my goal. I could see more and more clearly how beneficial these experiences were. For one thing, I never had the slightest inclination to addiction, which so many people struggle with nowadays. Needless to say, I was very curious to know what gave rise to these experiences, but could not clearly discern what it was by myself. Finally, about 15 years later, I read a paper by Dr. Thomas Rabeyron, a French parapsychologist, who had reached the conclusion that paranormal experiences are actually perfectly normal responses to stress. I resonated totally with what he said, as I had begun to see dimly the connecting link in all that I had gone through, as indeed events that had helped me to digest all the major things that had happened to myself. In my own array of experiences, in 3 of the cycles I have come through, the last quarter is the one that is usually the least eventful in terms of paranormal experiences. I do have a lot of obstruction to work through, but my big out of the bodies are standing behind me. And I managed to get through those last 5 or so years without much paranormal activity. However, in the 4th quarter of the 3rd cycle, I was becoming aware that the organization for which I worked was losing interest in my work. In addition, I underwent an attempted murder by someone I thought was a friend, just as I entered the last quarter. This was, of course, very unsettling. And as my attacker lived in the same house as I was, I had to live with the constant anxiety that I might be attacked again. This led me to undertake what I would now call a vision quest halfway through the last quarter. Oops, I'm sorry. I can't see because there's all these like people who are in this thing, but anyhow, I just have to do it. I just can't see my screen because there's all these things on the top. I don't know if you can see it anyhow. Anyhow, I went through 4 big experiences during the night. I went into a canyon by mistake. And I found out later that nobody that went in there ever came out alive. I was the only person that came out alive. It was an El Nino. It was cold. I was shuddering with the cold. And I realized suddenly that I was not breathing, but being breathed by the cosmos. Finally, 14 hours later, and then I fell asleep for 10 blissful hours. Finally, 14 hours later, as dusk was descending and I knew I could not survive another night in the cold and wet without food or warm clothes, I challenged my spiritual archetype about the fate of my work. If I died, that would be the end. His answer was to bring into view a group of husky young search and rescue guys who hauled me out of the creek I was walking in and saved my life. I conclude that this almost constant inspiration I was receiving was the response to the intense stress I was living under. As it happened in every moment of these 24 hours of intense facing of death, I felt such overwhelming joy and the power of intense meaning that I was blissed out all the way through. This experience massively raised my self-esteem and confidence and made it possible to survive and overcome all of the immediate obstacles I was having to face. And this is a rather blurry photo of me cheerily telling my family in Edinburgh 5 years later about what I went through. They were all falling off their chairs in horror, but I was a happy wee camper. The point I'm making here is that the amount of paranormal experience I had back to back for 24 hours at an unaccustomed time in the cycle, but under pretty massive stress. I take it as supporting my impression that as far as my life goes, the nature of paranormal events is indeed to be supportive of me at times of great stress. At the turn of the 20th century, several friends and colleagues in America were urging me to write an account of my life. I was very surprised at this request because I very seldom mentioned anything to anyone about my inner life. So exactly what motivated them, I do not really know, but they did keep up the pressure on me. One major reason I agreed was because my eyes had been open to the extent and depth of addiction and the destruction of life it was giving to. I had begun to think that perhaps hearing about a life like mine might in some way encourage people generally to start looking within themselves for the meaning and strength interior experiences had given at least me. So this was the book published by Ex Libris in 2010. That's Poor Wee Jean, and this is me all ready to go to America. Another impact, especially in the repetition of their context and content over time, was quite simply puzzlement about how these events could be so regular and systematic over time. Here I present how I saw them up to the age of 46. 2.5 consecutive 20-year cycles, within each of which was a series of experiences that all followed the same pattern that I have presented. I was totally baffled. In addition, putting all three together, I realized that this was part of a matrix in which each and every cell was interconnected with all of the others, both vertically and horizontally. When I was 46, I came across the fact that the Indian system of non-dual Vedanta had come forward in the 7th century of the Common Era with an experience model that was presented as a 3x3 matrix of 3 conceptual, stable, vertical, I don't know, I can't see it, vertical, what I call levels. And within those levels, these states of consciousness, this was a complete 3x3 matrix. Over time, in and through Kashmir Shaivism, this basic matricial model was filled in with actual lived data, and the matrices enlarged to 4x4. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a further, it's moved on. It became a 5x5 matrix. I applied it to the life of Swami Vivekananda and his life. I realized that Swami Vivekananda's life had a huge amount of impact on my own. And I studied in depth the process of his own development in a known time frame and discovered that his education in this monumental traditional mode resulted in a tightly structured matrix, a 5x5 matrix. And these are points of super consciousness with an S. And again, every single experience is totally interrelated with all of the others. This to me is the most important point. What I made of this was that I submitted it for as a doctoral candidate, and it turned into a thesis, Learning in Depth, a case study in twin 5x5 matrices of consciousness from Viadrina University, Frankfurt on Oder, Germany. This is where it's posted in the German world. And I put all of my stuff in academia. It's in there. For my part, I'm realizing the reason I was able to bring out this little known material extant in India since the 7th century of the Common Era is because I myself went through, though all unknowing why, the basic dynamic behind it. Without these experiences, I would be none the wiser. And this is just that all of my materials are on academia. You can get it in two, if you remember, this is the connection. There I have discussion groups and all kinds of things going on. But for those who are not members of academia, you can access the texts. All of my works are there and you can read and download it, but there's no interaction. So that's it.
Great job and wonderful talk. Really loved it. Thank you so much. So why don't everybody who has questions for our panel go ahead and put your questions in the chat. So we have one from Julianne for Sha'alah. Can cone and Nirvikalpa
Nirvikalpa.
Nirvikalpa.
Okay, well, I butchered it. Arise simultaneously.
Well, that's what I
Yeah.
experienced. Yes. The
Okay.
one was immediately consequent on the other. I think the koan acted like a portal, and what was in the portal was that state of samadhi. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So I have another question for you. So, you were talking about left and right brain and everything. And so many of us are always in our head. How do you recommend to people to get from our head into our hearts?
What I've experienced is that sufficient work in the head leads naturally to heart work. I think it's always to do with the force of your life, the kind of life that you lived. I was lucky because my physical existence was full of babies. I delivered 1,000 babies. I had 4 of my own. So there was lots of love. There was, just tripping over heart everywhere. So the mental work actually coupled with the physical work. If you go from one to the other, I think any activity followed sufficiently intensely will lead you to the plethora of all of them together.
Yes.
Very helpful. Kristin, Anne wants to know what started you in your life on a spiritual path. When did the bliss occur and what initiated your search? Please tell us your story before you became an energy practitioner.
Sure. Thank you so much for asking that. And I'll try to make it brief. When I was a teenager, spiritual awakening, I think like many people, it came through suffering. So when I was a teenager, I had a really good friend of the family, kind of a boyfriend, young love situation, who was diagnosed with cancer when I was a freshman and died when I was a senior. So my formative years, my high school experience, were being a witness to this cancer journey. But it's so strange because when I look back at that time, that's when I remember the bliss, because there was no duality in that experience. It was such a natural state of being, right? There was suffering, but there was also beauty. There was confusion, and then there was such clarity. There was devastating sadness and also joy that I had never known. So here I am, a 17-year-old living in this kind of state of oneness, this non-dual, it's all connected feeling. And I had assumed that that's how life was. This is the natural state of where we're meant to be. Now, I was a highly sensitive child, and, I see dead people. I was like one of those kind of growing up, but I could see the spiritual path, like what I now know as energy healing. And I was waiting for the doctors to introduce it into his treatment plan. This whole time we're just, really, I can still see and smell the hospital when we were walking the hallways, and like that bliss feeling where you remember every detail. And when he died, I was like, I lost all faith and trust. I don't know if you all remember that moment in your life where you realize like your parents are actually humans too, and not like knowing and that was it. And so I went from feeling this bliss to actually like being that angry teenager who out of spite actually cut myself off. I mean, talk about sticking my head in the sand. I went into engineering because I got to cut myself off totally. I got to live in a world of predictable rules, and, you know, I could engineer my way with my mind and my body through all of it. And again, so following this is when that happens, your spirit will get your attention. So I started to have all these crazy physical ailments that nobody could solve. And we're talking, I couldn't have a baby. I had weird abdominal pain, like tens of thousands of dollars of medical scans, couldn't figure out, which, by the way, was a cord that I pulled out during a yoga class, that an energetic cord, and all that went away, right, in a split second. But anyway, I went from the state of bliss to being cut off to surrendering back into it. And it was in the surrender that Rob had talked about that finally got me into that continuous flow state. But it was not without some messy moments there. So thank you for letting me share that.
Beautiful. Thank you. Althea, why do you believe the Virgin Mary creates so much emotional response from people from so many different backgrounds?
That is so interesting. Because she's recognized, you know, you won't get as many people if you're Jewish looking for Jesus. If there's a sighting for Jesus, they're not going to come out for it, but they will, they might, well, they were there because they heard that someone saw the Divine Mother. So it's like she's recognized in pretty much every religion. If you read the Quran, she's the only woman mentioned in the Quran. And I spoke to actually a lot of Muslims that were there. There was great reverence for Mary because she was the mother of Jesus. So I think that's it. And I think that this created such a return of people. I mean, the BBC came over and filmed this. I mean, this got international recognition, and it was written up in so many newspapers all over the world, and along with, you know, Mother sees Mary and taco, and man sees Jesus in the reflection of a bumper. I mean, I think it's reflective of everyone knows the Divine Mother. She doesn't seem to scare people, and what she represents and stands for is something that we all we revere. And I think that people are hungry to have a divine experience.
Yes.
This is why SAI is so important, because here's something else. A lot of people that I spoke to didn't have a background in religion. They weren't raised going to church or to temple. They didn't really know anything about Christianity or Judaism, some of them. And so I was like, well, is this a start for you to study? And they were like, yeah, because they want something to believe in. And what some people said that they wanted was structure. And a mother figure represents structure to a lot of people. And so the Divine Mother, all right, I'm there. I want to see what she can teach me. So I hope I answered that without going off.
Yeah, you did. That was great. Jean, did you want to share something about that question?
Oh, I'm a huge Divine Mother fan. And the tradition that I'm in, Sharada Devi was an Indian lady who was, it's a rather long story, but a Catholic lady read something about Mother, and she said, this is Mary living now. And the Divine Mother is very unifying, and it doesn't bring in conflict and aggression. And it's a big thing in the Indian tradition, is the worship of the Divine Mother. And I'm a huge fan of the Divine Mother. And it's very, very healing.
So Jean, what role do you think your mother's suicide and your dad's addiction play in your role? And what would you say is the main lesson that you've learned from all of your life experiences?
These experiences that I've had have made it possible for me to digest these experiences They don't affect me anymore. And the work with my spiritual teachers, you can transcend it. I can talk about it because it's part of my life, but it doesn't bother me anymore. In fact, I feel great sorrow for both of my parents, but they certainly didn't give me a good start in life. Anyhow, but I do feel for their suffering because they were suffering. And what was the other question?
What is the main lesson that you've learned through all these different experiences in your life?
I've learned that within myself is the answer to everything. And I play it as it lays. And I can't believe that I'm whistling off into my 5th cycle and it's all working itself out again. I just don't understand that. But I realize that what I have within me is something meaningful, because that doctoral thesis of the 5x5 matrices, it's nearly 1,000 pages long. And yet hundreds of people are reading it from all corners of the globe. I mean, it's really amazing. Indonesia, China, Russia, all over the world, people are reading that stuff. So it has some kind of meaning. And I'm just happy that, people are finding it, because the message is that everything is totally interconnected. That's what the matrix conveys. At least that's my understanding. Is that an answer? Is that answer?
Yes, it's an answer. Great, thank you. So how about maybe everybody will do one final question that you could all answer. Are all of you always connected with your guides? And are there times when you're not? And what do you do to help yourself stay connected? And whoever wants to go first, and maybe you can all answer that.
I'll go ahead first. Thank you for asking this question. What an important part of the spiritual awakening journey, right, is to feel that you are never alone. I will say at the beginning of my practice, I had to remember to connect, and I had to remember to ask, right? They're all just waiting to ask. So it was a little bit stop and start. I really focused on developing new energetic habits, right? So I was a student of habit formation so that I could really get into it. It was Post-it notes in the bathroom. It was like all kinds of stuff. So now I do feel continuously connected, and I feel empowered to go into the field and find guides for things. Like the other day, I was trying to think of a title for when I'm putting a new course together, and I was like, what is this? The hook and like all the marketing. And I went into the unified field and I asked for a guide to like the guide of successful titles to come, right. and talk to me, and like had this really great conversation. So I think it's awareness, it's habits. But every modality that I have studied, the common thread in there is just ask. All you have to do is ask.
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you. Who wants to go next?
I will.
Okay.
I know that I'm in touch with them all the time, whether I'm feeling it or not. I know that they're there everywhere, all around, even to the point of sometimes saying, back off a little, this is private. And I've, because I went through so much death, everybody in my family of origin died in a few years. It was very, very important to keep that awareness of connection. What I have found more effective than anything else is if I feel like I'm losing it, I just act as if I haven't. And from the acting comes an awareness of the connection that's already there.
Great answer.
Okay, I'll just chip in.
Okay.
Yeah. I've had 4 spiritual teachers. 2 of them died, and each one met me with the problems of that cycle, and they took me right to the core. And I'm sitting here now waiting for the 5th one. It may sound a little mercenary, but they're all manifestations of the same spiritual reality. And they accepted me, they supported me, and they're still part and parcel of my life. I mean, I think of them every day. And I know, because I'm moving into a different realm. I've gone through all these realms. I'm going, and there will be, I know, in a few years, if I'm still alive, of course. Of course, I'm not supposed to say that, My granny used to say, if I'm spared. She was from the north of Scotland, and she always said, I'll do it if I'm spared. So I have to say that because people say, oh, don't talk about dying. I said, well, okay, if I'm spared, I'll meet my next spiritual guide. It's probably somebody I'm going to fight tooth and nail with if the last one I had has anything to do with it. But still, you get that spiritual connection and you move forward.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Althea.
Yes, I have forgotten the question. Is it about our guides?
Yeah. So are you always connected with your guides? Do you ever feel like you can't hear them? What
sometimes,
do
like,
you do to stay connected?
Sometimes we don't hear them, and like what I was talking about today, because they want us to make a decision since we have free will here. And we have to discern. I mean, really, we're here for spiritual lessons. So there are times where I'm like, oh, come on, just tell me, because I don't want to make a mistake. And they're like, there aren't mistakes. And they're not, but you always feel like, you know, you want to get the right answer, or, you know, but that doesn't always happen. So I've known for so long that I really fumble around and feel so empty if I don't get up in the morning and say, God, I am so grateful for being here. Lead me and guide me. I surrender to your will. And that is like my greeting for the day every morning. And if I don't do that, then I just kind of feel empty. You know, I am nothing without them. Is how
Yes.
I feel.
Beautiful. And yes, for the people asking, all the videos will be on the SAI YouTube channel. And I think we'll go ahead, and I just want to thank everybody on the panel. You all brought so much amazing information tonight.
Yes.
Thank you so much.